How are you today?
I'm very good, thank you, and I'm happy to be here.
Yes, I'm very excited about today's interview. You're somebody that I've wanted to have on the podcast for almost a year now since I read Freddie Silva's book, Secrets in the Field. But before we get into all that, I want to give you a little introduction so everybody knows who we're talking to here. So today we have Barbara Hand Clow, who is an internationally acclaimed author, astrologer, ceremonial teacher, known for her pioneering work in consciousness studies, ancient civilizations, earth energies. She is the author of several influential books, including The Pleiadian Agenda and Alchemy of Nine Dimensions, both of which I have read and which are really amazing reads. She also wrote The Mayan Code, which explores the intersection of science, mysticism, extraterrestrial intelligence, with a background in both academic and esoteric traditions. Barbara's work invites readers to expand their understanding of time, multidimensionality, and human evolution. Barbara, how was that? Did I leave anything out there?
That was perfect. Thank you.
All right. Like I said, I found your work about a year ago when I read Freddie Silva's book, who I had on the podcast for episode 12, when he cited your work a couple times in his book. One was the Barbury Castle Tetrahedron, which you cited in your book, Alchemy of Nine Dimensions, where you actually drew that symbol about 24 to 48 hours before it was even discovered or even came down. What I'd like to do is maybe just pull up a picture of the Barbury Castle, and I have it behind me, by the way, but I'm going to pull it up on the screen here. And then maybe you can talk me through that crop circle and your experience with that.
Amazing.
So talk us through this crop circle and your experience of drawing it before it actually came down.
Yeah, I drew a version of this, very close to it actually, and sent it to my German publisher because I felt like it was a good representation of the 9 dimensions, the empty circle being the first 3 dimensions, and then the circle was 6 divisions, being the 3rd through the 6th dimension, and then that unusual drawing at the other end of it. It's called something. I'll see if I can think of it in a minute. But that represents the 7th through the 9th dimensions. And also...
Like the ratchet?
Yeah, that's right, the ratchet, good, because it's a musical term. And then the center of it with 3 circles and the very large circle in the middle also is a representation of the first 3 dimensions, which we exist in, the iron core crystal in the center of the Earth, and then the space between the iron core crystal and the crust of our planet, which is the telluric subterranean realm, and then linear space and time in the 3rd dimension. So I sent it a drawing that I made of this because I thought it was a good symbol. And then 2 days later, Luke Krauss of my German publishing company sent me a fax with the picture of this crop circle and said, look what happened after you drew that crop circle. And that was my first opportunity to realize how much our minds can be involved with circle makers. And then, of course, I went on for 3 or 4 years as a crop circle researcher because I was so fascinated by the capacity of our minds.
Yeah, and just so the audience can see this, I want to pull up the picture of what you actually drew before this was discovered. Let me know if you see this now.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is what you drew. So can you explain to people your process? Because you weren't just drawing this doodling on a piece of paper. You had a process of drawing symbols to get you ready to write. Is that correct?
Yeah. And actually, a lot of creative people do this. I draw symbols in order to create and to write. And I also make sculptures. And for every one of my books, I've made a sculpture for that particular book. And the reason that I did that, I just made little small, interesting, little hand-sized kind of sculptures out of sacred objects. And I'm a mother with 4 children, and I also was working for Bear & Company Publishing. So when I got a chance to write, I would get an hour or 2 in front with my computer, and I just simply would put the sculpture to my left-hand side and just start to work. So the sculpture kept the artwork going. So that's what I was doing with this symbol. And I was working with the German publisher to get the German publication illustrations correct. And that's how that happened.
That is truly remarkable. And this is what Freddie Silva had put in his book. And that's what sparked me to reach out to you, because this is absolutely fascinating. And through the last 12 months, I've spoken with a few different crop circle researchers who have done similar things where they have had groups of people and they've created symbols and drawings to see if they could invoke a formation in the fields. And I've talked to two prominent researchers, and that has happened. They have told me that story, that they did that more than once, which I thought was very interesting. But that formation has always been very intriguing to me, because it's my understanding that one kind of broke the mold of the simple circles that were showing up, and that this one was highly complex, highly geometric, and kept the researchers busy for a little bit of time trying to understand what this was.
And then I was touring the world back in those days, 1980s. I was teaching for a company called Power Places Tours, and they were taking me just all over the planet to sacred sites so that I could do activations and do research and teach and stuff like that. And so I had a group at Salisbury Cathedral, which is split very close to the fields where so many crop circles have come into form. And I had a group of about 50 people at Salisbury Cathedral, students. And I also had some of the major crop circle researchers like Colin Andrews and different people were there in order to verify what I was doing. And then what I did is I did another symbol, which happened to be a symbol for the way the 9 dimensions affect us physically as humans on the planet. And I drew the symbol as best I could with crop circle makers. And yeah, there you go. See, those are my symbols. And they're a little bit of an adaptation of the illustrations in the Pleiadian agenda and then in Alchemy of Nine Dimensions. But the reason I use those Mayan numerical symbols, if you take the first one over there with that long line, that that's the 5th dimension, 6 dimensions, 5 plus 1, 7th dimension, 5 plus 2, 8th dimension, 10 plus 1 or something like that. I'm not quite sure what the, and then the 9th dimension was 5 plus 4. I think that 8th dimensional one is missing 2 dots. But at any rate, I figured the circle makers could somehow work with the Mayan numerical system better than the normal numerical system. And so then what I did was I had the students stare at this image, the first one and then the second one, for maybe 5 minutes or so. I said, really stare at it and really memorize it in your mind. And then I'm going to have you close your eyes and I'm going to have you visualize the symbol that you just memorized in your third eye. And so all of the students did that. And then I also had them transfer the image of the symbol back to their medulla oblongata, which is a place at the top of the spine where it connects with our skull, which is basically the reptilian brain. And then we closed our eyes and we just did a little breathing and stuff like that. And then over the next 2 or 3 days, the crop circle researchers who had attended, as well as other ones, started faxing me renditions of this particular image, which it looks like you've got them there.
Yeah, I got them here. I'm going to pull it up here so everybody can see this. Just
And
let me know if you can see this.
I just have to share with you that this just blows my mind to this day. Okay, this is a cock fractal. And this is obviously a rendition of the symbol that I had transmitted through the students. And it was obviously very smart of me to use those Mayan dots because they found that fairly easy to work with. So somebody sent me that one. And to this day, this blows my mind that this is possible. But the cock fractal is a 7th to 8th dimensional pattern that scientists recognize. And so somehow our ability, the students and me, we were able to use our brain waves and our brain frequencies to transmit this type of symbolic scientific information. And as you know from reading Alchemy of Nine Dimensions, we now are hearing about the Blue Brain Project. And we now have scientific evidence that the human brain operates according to 9 to 11 dimensions. And most importantly, the human brain transmits visuals, which are called topological drawings. It actually transmits from our brain symbolically, it's extremely important for us to start being able to understand what this is, what it means, and most importantly, what science is doing with this information, because this is probably the basis of artificial intelligence. This is probably advanced artificial intelligence very rapidly, this discovery of our brain frequency patterns.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I think they've also discovered that the mind is set up quite geometrically and that they can map the brains of mice. I believe they did that in that study you're referring to. Was it called is it the Blue Brain
Blue
Project?
Brain Project coming out of Lausanne, Switzerland. Yes. And so
Yes.
it's hard for us to talk about the Blue Brain Project. What I did in Alchemy of Nine Dimensions in my revised introduction is I described it in detail and I gave the names of the scientists and the names of the institute. So we don't have to do that here. But what happened is an announcement occurred in 2015, right when the scientists who had discovered this were all excited. And they released a lot of images and they released a lot of information about it, which fortunately I got off my computer and Xeroxed and I've kept it. But after that, this has gone pretty quiet because immediately the larger scientific realm realized, aha, this is the missing key that we need to go to the next level. So I think this has been subverted into secrecy by the artificial intelligence scientists, but eventually it's all going to come out. And of course, I'm writing about it and talking about it all the time. And so is Radu Cinemar in his Transylvania series. They're not going to be able to hold this one secret forever. So what's important about this, Matt, is that we now have a palpable feeling for how our brains function. Okay, so I discovered that palpable sense of how my brain functions based on my own research into nine dimension. But since then, since 2015, whenever I start traveling dimensionally, let's say I'm going to go into the seventh dimension in order to be activated by sacred sound, let's say that's just where I'm going to go. It's much more powerful when you realize that as you listen to that sound, your brain waves are responding to the actual frequencies of the sound. And that's pretty amazing. And
So I wanted to, maybe for the audience sake, who has not read Alchemy of Nine Dimensions, could you briefly break down the nine dimensions? Could you do it so well in the book, where you start with the center of the earth, where you've got the iron core, and then you go into the mantle and the crust, and then you work your way through it. Can you give everyone sort of a brief rundown of the nine dimensions and how you see them?
yeah, and luckily it's fairly simple and easy to do because it actually mirrors the way our body functions. So if we're going to get into accessing nine dimensions, the first step is to basically I like to sit in a circle that's marked by the four directions, a sacred circle, because I find it easier to go into the earth, the center of the earth, if I have a sense of north, south, east, and west. So what happens is you go down into the iron core crystal in the center of the earth, and you receive an activation of knowledge because the iron core crystal is resonating with all of the centers or the first dimension of all of the bodies in the universe. The iron core crystal in the center of our planet is resonating with all of the centers of the stars and galaxies and planets in the universe, which is a miracle. So then you rise from the center of the earth. And some people just want to hang out down there because they like how it feels. But you just draw yourself back into your own body by going to the telluric realm. The telluric realm is all the space between the iron core crystal and the surface of the planet. And it is the second dimension of our planet. Then you emerge into the third dimension, into your sacred circle, oriented to the directions, and you are in linear space and time. There you are in linear space and time with some kind of amazing wisdom awareness that comes to you from having gone into the iron core crystal. And so there you are in 3D and 3D, and you contemplate the wisdom that you have just received from the center of our planet, and it begins to polarize and dualize. It begins to widen, and it begins to split between dark and light, good and evil, positive and negative. Because as we start to move out of our bodies and move into more subtle dimensions, there is a canopy of consciousness that is all above our head, like a canopy. And that canopy is formed by the emotional processing that we do when we exist in 3D. So as we live in our linear space and time dimension, and we encounter various issues on our planet, we're always thinking of the positive and negative, the light and the dark. It's just how we've been created. But as we start to move our energy into that canopy, that duality and that polarity starts to become more like a canopy of energy all above, like an auric canopy above us. And this is very important because what it's doing is it's energizing the fifth dimension, which seems to enter the canopy over here. Yeah, and you see that in some of those images that I was drawing. But as we go into the fifth dimension, the heart opens. And this is a very profound experience with dimensionality because the heart becomes larger and bigger and more expansive, and it begins to spread throughout all of existence. And what's important now is the sixth dimension opens, because the sixth dimension is the dimension of sacred geometry. And with sacred geometry, and this is the crystal that I always work with because it's very typical of sacred geometry. And with the power of sacred geometry, the heart then becomes part of the universe while it also beats in our own bodies. And then as the sixth dimension begins to become more and more activated by the power of the heart, the dimension that generates the sixth dimension activates. And that is the seventh dimension, which is the realm of sound. And so in every single spiritual tradition on this planet, mysteriously, Vedic tradition, Hindu tradition, Native American, the Bible, sound always creates reality. And the sixth dimension is like the higher dimension of our existence here in the third dimension. So what this is saying is sound generates the geometry, and then the geometry formulates into the opening of the heart. And then with the open heart, we come back down the other way through the polarity and duality and back into our own bodies. And so then we have to ask, what's generating the seventh dimension? The seventh dimension is a dimension of brilliant white light of the divine. And you could think of it as God, you could think of it as Christ consciousness, you could think of it as Buddha. However you want to think of the eighth dimension, all of us are aware that there is a presence in our universe which is generating our existence itself, that loves us and cares about every single thing we think about and do. And then the fascinating thing about the eighth dimension is the ninth dimension is the dimension of time. And so this is a very different system than Einstein's system. And as a matter of fact, by putting time into the fourth dimension, Einstein actually generated a stranglehold on physics for at least the last 100 years, because time is actually functioning at a much higher dimension, and time is the organizer and conductor and director of the universe itself, and time manifests issues in a planet or in a sun or in a galaxy when it is time for them to occur. And so the Mayan calendar, for example, is a very good example of how the ninth dimension functions, which is the reason I spent so much time on it, because the Mayan calendar represents the time calendar that has been the most relevant for us on this planet for about the last 3 or 4,000 years, because it has a lot of information in it. But now what's coming forth, even beyond the Mayan calendar, is the Vedic calendar is activating now, because many people who followed the Vedas and the Vedic calendar, sacred scriptures of ancient India, we now recognize that the Kali Yuga ended at the end of March of this year. So we are actually existing. Talk about a 2012. We are existing at the moment in time when the Kali Yuga has ended, and the Kali Yuga has been a catastrophic, very difficult cycle.
And one of the things you do that's so well in Alchemy of Nine Dimensions is you give meditations for the reader at the beginning of the chapters as you begin to explain these and break these down, these are very difficult concepts, esoteric knowledge that you were putting in a very consumable way for the average reader, which was great because I've read some other books on these topics and I always walk away thinking like, well, you're not giving me anything to hold on to, but you don't do that. You give a lot of details and scientific backing and things for people to hold on to as they dip their toes into these very difficult subjects to digest. So I want to thank you for that.
I'm smiling over here because the Pleiadians call this goddess alchemy. And they talk about how the alchemists constantly lead you down another road. You're supposed to burn the furnace. You're supposed to turn yourself to gold, whatever, without ever telling you how to actually do it. And goddess alchemy just simply says, look, it's real clear what's happening here and what we have in our reality and in our universe. And so let's talk about it. Let's reveal it. Let's give it.
Yeah, I'm glad that they did. And I'm glad that they pick people to communicate this information to that are capable and are great communicators to bring that to everybody else. Well, I wanted to take the conversation in another direction because there's some work you turned me on to, Peter Moon's work along with the author Radu Sinamar. They've written a series of books about underground structures, things that have apparently been kept hidden by certain groups of people because they know this stuff exists. And I find it very interesting now that we have these Italian researchers that have applied the synthetic aperture radar Doppler tomography technology of satellites to map some of these structures under the Khafre pyramid, which is G2, the second biggest pyramid on the Giza Plateau. They are adamant that their work is sound and that there is actual voids and structures under there. Whether they're natural or not, I think it's still up for debate, but apparently that stuff really is there. And here you have turning me onto this work by Peter Moon and Radu Sinamar about the structures under the Busigi Mountains in Romania. Can you talk a little bit about this and how this all sort of ties together?
Yeah, it's impossible for these structures that have been found by the SARS technology or at the Busegi complex for them to be natural. They are not. We know this just from science and the way matter forms. So these are structures that were made by someone. And in both cases, these stone rooms and long tunnels are 1,000 to 2,000 to 3,000 feet below the surface. And this is amazing. And these kinds of structures have now been discovered under the Busegi Mountains in Romania, under the Giza Plateau, under Iraq, under Göbekli Tepe, and mysteriously for us as Americans, under Montana, north of Helena, Montana. And these structures appear to be there's a couple of cultures involved here as far as I can tell. And I'm in the middle of doing research right now on the Montana megaliths. Now, let's be careful here because the megaliths are above the ground. And in Montana, you can walk all over the place and go look at dolmens and walls like the long walls in Peru or incredibly tall standing stones. Those are on the surface. So it's very important as we approach this topic to realize that the megalithic monuments and the pyramids and the complex of Göbekli Tepe, etc., those are in the third dimension in linear space and time. But these underground structures are in the second dimension. And this for me, Matt, I've been in almost a 2-week long level of revelation the last 2 weeks because I've started to realize that the second dimension is awakening. By the discovery of these structures and the fact that Radu Chinnamar has proven by his own books, Radu Chinnamar was involved in research on the structures in Romania with the American secret government and the Romanian secret government over a period of 10 or 12 years. And he was allowed to write about the work on these structures and the activation of these structures. Now, what on earth am I talking about? These tunnels and rooms have technological objects in them, various time-traveling devices and various levels of record-keeping devices. And these are active at this moment in time. And as far as we know, they may have been active since they were built. So in Romania and Montana, we're talking about structures that are 50,000 to around 72,000 years old. And that's the data bank, 40,000 years old, maybe. I'm involved in research right now to try to get the timing of the construction of these structures over the last 100,000 years. And the reason I'm doing that is if we go back to this number 72,000 years ago, we are going right back to the eruption of the Toba volcano, supervolcano. And that was one of the largest super volcano eruptions that has ever occurred on the
Can you
planet.
spell that for it? Toba?
Yeah, Toba, and put a Grab accent after it. Toba supervolcano.
Okay. Super, okay. I'll have to check that one out.
And so then I was hearing also 40,000 years a lot. And the eruption of the Campi Flegrei supervolcano was 40,000 years ago. And when that happened, Neanderthal went into decline and Homo sapiens began to dominate as the human species on our planet. So I'm very suspicious that a lot of these structures are very tied into being built before a cataclysmic event and that they went underground. And the fact that the ones that we found, the underground structures, second dimensional structures that we have found, the fact that they are almost always, if not always, under sacred sites, such as the Khafre Pyramid or the Great Pyramid and Göbekli Tepe. So there's many indications here that advanced civilizations were existing on this planet and had the means to figure out when a cataclysm was imminent, and they had the ability to go and build structures underground. And this fits very well with a lot of the things that Edgar Cayce said about the Hall of Records. And when you read Radu Chinnamar's book about the journey to Egypt, I think it's called The Mystery of Egypt, Radu Chinnamar took a tunnel from under the Carpathian Mountains in Romania and took it all the way to Egypt to a stone room, a very large and beautiful stone room that is filled with records that the American and Romanian scientists have still not been able to open. This is obviously the Hall of Records. And what Edgar Cayce said about the Hall of Records is that the ancient Egyptians took their knowledge underground because a cataclysm was imminent. So I think we're unraveling this 100,000 year cycle now, and I'm certainly very involved in that.
Yeah. The more I look into ancient sites and underground structures, the more I'm starting to have the suspicion that human beings were spending large swaths of time underground. And of course, we know about the Younger Dryas impact theory that happened around 11,000 years ago. And so we know that there are these cataclysms. And I think Randall Carlson has clocked like cataclysms, like 20,000 years, 30,000 years. You just go back and you can see impact craters and all different types of things that have happened to the Earth when we go through these turbulent times. So it makes sense if you have intelligent human beings walking around that if they want to survive, the best place to survive is probably an underground structure.
And
I think
who was the person who tracked that? I missed
he's a catastrophism expert. His name is Randall Carlson.
Randall Carlson.
Randall Carlson. Yep, he's got YouTube channels, Rumble channels, website. You won't be hard to find his work.
Okay. Great, because I missed him somehow. I'm very book oriented, and your generation is more computer oriented. So it's like I missed some stuff when that happens. So thanks for that. Because
Yeah, no, absolutely. You'll find his
that out
book
right
best.
now. Yeah, I'm trying to figure that out right now because I am the carrier of the records of a 100,000-year Pleiadian tradition. In other words, because I was born into the family, to my Cherokee grandfather, I've been the carrier of those records. And so I've been researching these 100,000 years for years and years. But all of a sudden, wow, it's just opening up universally on the planet. It's incredible.
Yes. And I had a question for you about, because you brought up Edgar Casey, and he's someone whose work I'm a little bit familiar with. And he did say sometime at the end of the 20th century, that they would be discovering this void or this chamber that you've referred to under the paw of the Sphinx. And I've always found it interesting that they did ground penetrating radar back in the 90s. And they confirmed there is some sort of void there under the ground. But for whatever reason, they haven't excavated it sufficiently or explored it sufficiently enough. But the other caveat that he said was that it would be discovered if the consciousness of human beings had been raised enough and if people were ready for it. And so, to my knowledge, nobody's explored this chamber unless it's been done secretly. But now we have this big push for people on YouTube and their podcasts talking about these underground structures under the Sphinx, talking about these underground structures under the Khafre Pyramid. So I'm wondering if this is all just building up to this point where the technology is increasing, so where now they can do these radar from satellites, these SARS radar, and it's going to get to a point where there's going to be so much evidence for it that whoever's trying to keep this quiet will no longer be able to do that. Do you know who Zahi Hawass is?
I agree with you that nobody's going to be able to stop it. And I really do believe that the key to the whole thing is Radu Chinamar. The reason being, okay, let's go back to 2003. The structures under the Buceti Mountains were discovered by the Romanian government. Actually, there were some discoveries in the 90s that they kept quiet. But by 2000, the Romanian government was very open about a sphinx in the Buceti Mountains and then these structures underground underneath the sphinx. Okay. So then what are you going to do? Interestingly, at the same time, the Americans were using technology. I don't think it was SARS technology. I think it's an earlier ground penetrating psychology, maybe technology, maybe LIDAR, I'm not sure. But the Americans discovered that there was these structures were under Iraq. Now, this is secret at this point. If it weren't for Radu Chinamar, we wouldn't know what I'm talking about right now. And he didn't connect the dots, but I connected the dots. The American ground penetrating radar saw these structures under Iraq sometime around 2003, right around the time of the invasion of Iraq. Remember weapons of mass destruction? Was weapons of mass destruction. I think that was an allusion to this discovery under Iraq. Whatever is going on here, the structures under Iraq are the same as the ones under the Buceti Mountains. So at that point, the American Secret Services and the government contacted Romania and they said, okay, now what I'm doing now is I'm describing Radu Chinamar's books. Because what the Romanians did was when the Americans approached him and said, okay, we want to work with you, top secret, we want to figure this out. Romanians said, and the Americans said, we'll give you our technology if you will let us explore your site under the Pisetti loans. The Americans said, okay, we will allow you to come to Romania and explore these tunnels. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about stone rooms with 3 tunnels leaving the stone room. One of them going to Tibet, one of them going to the inner earth, and one of them going to Egypt. Now, right there, that ought to just knock your socks off. But when I heard about that back in 2008, I basically dismissed all of the stuff I'm talking about right now for another 10 years because I said to myself, this is so far off the wall that only an idiot would even believe this. But now what's happening, so much is being discovered that it's getting to be harder and harder to deny the truth of what Radu Cinema wrote about. So the Romanian government says, we'll let you come in and explore our structures and we'll take your technology and use it, but on the condition that one of our people, a Romanian person, can write about what we're finding. So the Americans had to agree because the Romanians weren't going to let them into the structures unless they agreed. And that began a process from 2003 up until about 2018 of exploring the tunnel to Tibet, the tunnel into the inner earth, the tunnel to Egypt, and the activation of the technology. And that's what's in Radu Cinamar's books. So the reason I'm belaboring this a little bit, Matt, is because we would not be able to understand at this point what might be going under Egypt with the stuff that was discovered by the SARS technology if we didn't have Radu Cinamar's books. And then I can make one simple comment that might help listeners understand this a little bit better. I taught in Egypt quite a few times, and I know a lot of other teachers who have taught in the temples in Egypt. And when you go to Egypt and you go to Cairo, fly into Cairo, and then when you leave Cairo and you start to head to the Giza Plateau, which is outside of Cairo, there's a certain point where a totally different energy field occurs. And every teacher I've ever talked to and my own students, this energy field is palpable. And it's only now that I realize that technology under the Copyright Pyramid has been active probably for thousands of years. And when you get close to that energy, you feel it. So we're talking, I think what's important at this point is we're right on that threshold of people realizing, including me, that this is a real thing. This isn't Disneyland. This isn't science fiction. This is real. And the reason Radu Cinamar's books are so important is because Peter Moon, who wrote books about the Philadelphia experience, about the Montauk Project, about remote viewing, Peter Moon does a wonderful job of making it very clear he did not science fiction. This is real.
I wanted to ask you about this idea that the people that know this information, people that are working in government agencies and people that have knowledge of these underground structures, there's this idea that they have to somehow tell everybody about it in a way to which it can be like they have to put the information out there. They can't just keep it secret. It's almost like this esoteric thing they have to do. Are you familiar with this idea that they're saying, hey, write this book, but maybe they do that in knowing that people won't believe it? Is this a thing that you've come across?
That's a misinformation technique, sure, to make it they constantly, like, I'm a dumb astrologer and a dumb channeler. Even though the secret government, see, the reason Radu Cinema is so important is he shows how the secret government is using and studying this technology. And here is the really ironic issue at this moment in time. Radu Cinema and another character in this, another Romanian secret researcher, they've established the fact that you cannot activate this technology and work with it unless you have a certain level of consciousness. So we have a really interesting thing going on right now where a lot of the people in the government and in the Masons and all that who are trying to discover what to do about this, they don't have the higher consciousness that is required. Most importantly, you have to have an open heart of absolute total integrity. And so this is a really funny situation right now where a bunch of people who always wanted to just be materialistic scientists are being forced to actually open up higher levels of consciousness in order to find what they're looking for. Isn't that funny?
It is funny. And it's a problem when we go looking into the past and we start looking for ourselves, right? Or if we're going out and looking for extraterrestrial civilizations, we're constantly looking for ourselves. Whereas you don't know what turn life might have taken in another part of the galaxy, another part of the universe, another part of reality that we don't perceive. It could have gone in such a different direction that's not us. And this is also a problem when we look at ancient sites. When people say maybe there was an advanced culture that was lost, one of the things people say, okay, where are the cars? Where are the airplanes? Maybe they didn't do that. Maybe they had discovered another way of living, a completely different philosophy, a completely different technology that's so quote unquote alien to us that we're never going to see it until you start opening up a little bit and say, hey, wait a minute here. Maybe what we're looking at here, maybe this stone structure over here isn't just a stone temple. Maybe there's something else going on here that we don't see with our eyes. And we have all these people that claim that they feel energies. And I'm not one of these people. I've never experienced that before, but we have a lot of people that say that. And so then you have the people that don't feel that just trash on that idea. And they're not open to it because they're not seeing it through that lens. So I'm wondering if maybe this kind of awakening that everyone's going through right now with these growing pains that the human race is like wiggling its way up to these ideas, and that mainstream science is having a hard time adjusting to because they can't grab it, they can't hold it, and they don't see it. So it just seems like we're in like these growing pains of understanding these very strange things.
But yeah, it's a really good way to put it. And I think with the end of the Kali Yuga, the lid is off. And so it isn't just you struggling with activating yourself and maybe feeling some things that you feel like you haven't felt, but everybody around you is doing the same thing. And so we've entered now into the realm of a group activation, which I think is going to be much easier for everybody. Much easier for me because, see, as a teacher, and I've worked with activating people. I remember I was teaching with John Michel in Egypt, and John Michel is an incredible English sacred geometrical expert and mystic and esoteric master. And I went on a trip with John and a group of students to activate various sacred sites, mainly in Cornwall. And what John did is whenever we did a meditation and an activation, he would just go wandering off with the book someplace. So we got to the last day, and I was doing a wonderful ceremony with a teacher named Heyoka Merrifield, who unfortunately died a couple of years ago. And I said, John, Heyoka Merrifield is like one of the most incredible ceremonial teachers on the planet. Why don't you just stay with us and meditate? Okay, so we did it. We did a ceremony, we did an activation, and it lasted 20 minutes or whatever. We were on the edge of a amazing chasm where if anybody fell asleep or anything, they could fall off the edge. So I was being really careful with where everybody's located, including John. But John parked himself up on a nice big flat rock. We came out of the ceremony. I looked around to make sure that everybody was okay. And there was John up on the top of the rock, completely zonked. So I got the students to go out safely. And I went up to John and I said, John, it's Barbara. And he woke up like that and he said, oh, I just found out what it's like to meditate. Now imagine that with John Michel. But he had such a strong left brain and such an incredible grasp on geometry. And so this is a group awakening at this point, which I think is just so much more fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've talked about John Michel sort of ad nauseum on this podcast, but he's somebody who was so gifted in his discoveries of geometry and metrology and understanding the measurements of these ancient sites like Stonehenge, and using that to discover the Earth Moon diagram and relating that back to the book of Revelations with John. And he's done some incredible work. And yeah, to hear that story that he joined in on one of your meditations and was blown away stood out to me in your book. That's a fascinating story.
It would, yeah. The teacher stories are the fun.
Absolutely. Barbara, I wanted to wrap things up here, and I have one more question for you, really. Are you familiar with the former Ministry of Antiquities in Egypt, Zahi Hawass?
Yes.
Okay. So I'd heard of him throughout the years, but I had only maybe heard him speak once or twice. But just the other day, he released an interview on the Joe Rogan podcast. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that podcast, but it's the Joe Rogan podcast. It's typically number one in the world. Yeah. It's very popular. So he had Zahi Hawass on, and I watched it, and I thought it was interesting because he's someone that people look at as, I'm going to say, quote unquote, a gatekeeper, right? Somebody who's an authority on Egypt because he spent 50 some years there. In that interview, he seemed like he was very cagey and trying to control the conversation. This is just my opinion. I'm not saying this is what he did, but from an outsider looking in, do you think there are people out there that try to control the narrative of the history of these ancient sites to keep people from maybe finding more discoveries?
I absolutely do. And I've seen how Zahi Hawass operates, and he's obviously an extremely high Mason, and that's fine. But he obviously is attempting to control the sites in Egypt, and particularly the Giza Plateau. And he is the largest block. I wouldn't call him a gatekeeper. I call him a blocker on the truth coming out about the Giza Plateau. But nothing's going to be able to stop it, not even a person like Zahi Hawass. And in Radu Chinamar's books, Radu discusses the Masons in detail and how they operate. So if you want to really understand just exactly how Zahi Hawass operates, just read Radu Chinamar. And see, this is so amazing that we have something now that we can grasp and hold on to that's real. And thank you, Peter Moon, for giving that to us as a gift. We need it at this point. Yeah.
Absolutely. Barbara, this was a fascinating conversation. I really want to thank you. And I want to acknowledge one thing, that there are a lot of people that write maybe one or two books in this space. But when someone has the longevity, like a Freddie Silva or yourself, where they've been doing this for decades and have the respect and the success that they've had, I think it's important to recognize that, because these are very difficult topics. A lot of it gets dismissed by people. They don't want to look at this. They're not open-minded enough to say, hey, maybe there is something here. And so I think it's very important when we have an individual like yourself who's had the longevity and has had this work that you've done. It's important to acknowledge that. So I want to thank you for all your timing and effort and what you've done.
Well, I really appreciate it. And I'd just like to say two quick things. First of all, the most exciting thing to me at this point is the awakening of your generation, and even people in their 20s at this point awakening, because the more that you go down in age, the more open people are. So it's just a delight to me. And then also, I forgot what I was going to say. I had something important to say, but it just went out the window.
That happens to me sometimes.
I know what. Alchemy of Nine Dimensions also has, at the end of the book, you can activate the music for Nine Dimensions, which was composed by Michael Stearns, who is the composer behind Battlestar Galactica and a lot of the really big Hollywood films on the universe itself. And then my husband, Jerry, who I teach with, he read the Nine Dimensions for us and taped it. And that's also, you can, because your generation, especially, you like to hear things. So people should definitely download the meditations and the alchemical music.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else you want to leave everybody with? You want to tell them how they can find your work, how they can find your books, things like that?
Yeah, there's about 15 books, so there's lots to read. And then my website is handclow2012.com. And if you go to handclow2012.com, I am doing special readings from 23 to 2027, from 2023 to 2027 at the time of the seasons, because I think that this end of the Kali Yuga and the opening and the awakening is going to culminate in 2027. And so I'm attempting to coach people every 3 months, spring equinox, fall, and summer solstice. So it's there for free. Just go to the website every 3 months and check it out.
Very cool. I'll put links for that in the description below. I really want to thank you again, Barbara. This was a fascinating conversation. I hope you'll come back on sometime.
Definitely going to come back on. I don't get a chance to talk to very many people who understand things as well as you do, so I love that.
I appreciate that. And it was great having you on. Thanks, everybody, for checking out the podcast, and have a great night.